you very much, Sumit, and distinguished guests and panelists. It's really quite an honor for me to be here today talking to you. So thank you very much for the kind invitation. Just to briefly describe the International Water Association, we're a membership association. We have around 10,000 members all around the world. We have 50 specialist groups that research quite deeply into various topics around water. We publish around 15 academic journals, about 50 books every year. And we have very major events. We have world congresses that usually have about 10,000 participants. And we have a development congress, which attracts around 3,000 participants. And actually, our most successful development congress in the history of the association was in 2019 in Colombo, in Sri Lanka. And we had great support from everyone in Sri Lanka in making that a great success. In terms of, and we have offices, of course, in London, in China, in Nanjing, we have quite a big office, and we have an office in Chennai, and also in India, and also an office in Nairobi, in Kenya. In terms of climate change, we are doing quite a lot of activities at IWA. We have several programs which touch upon or have at the center climate change. One of the programs that we have is around basin connected systems, where we try to understand the entire watershed and encourage our water sector professionals and academics to have a very sort of systems view and understand the challenges of water for both agriculture, for industry, for the city, and also for nature, and really try to, through modeling, understand what are the transfer of benefits between these different sectors and how can one sector, by using water once and then sharing it with another sector, we can reduce the overall water footprint. In relation to that, we have been looking at the impacts of climate change, particularly on water resources, and really trying to understand how to respond to the uncertainties associated with some of those changes. And you must understand that climate, of course, is going to affect our water quantity. But on the demand side, we have much change in terms of the demographics, in terms of the living standards of people. So on the demand side, we also see big changes. So it's really trying to understand all those global change pressures and what the impact of that would be. And with respect to uncertainty, we are seeing the development of much more flexible systems, systems that are more modular in their design so that they can incrementally grow to respond to the heavy uncertainties associated with water availability moving forward. An interesting area, and I think some of the speakers touched upon it, is this tension between mitigation and adaptation. You find, for example, with the agricultural sector, this tension between water management and the generation of greenhouse gases. And there is quite a lot of research that suggests that water conservation and less water application for irrigation can change the balance between, say, carbon dioxide emissions from agriculture versus methane production from greenhouse gases. Also, our wish to produce more food and the implementation of fertilizers also generates quite a lot of nitrous oxides, which also are contributing to global warming. So this sort of trying to understand, that if you improve one thing, that it might have some unintended consequences in another areas is also quite interesting. We have another program called Nature-Based Solutions, where we're looking at how to use nature to attenuate some of the large volumes of water that might be expected in the future, and how to use the natural capacity of soils, etc., to treat water and to reduce the overall dependency on grey infrastructure or concrete. And we find that these nature-based solutions, are quite flexible because you can expand them and grow them over time because, you're just expanding, if you like, land area for percolation to take place. But also they're much better at handling shocks. So when we're looking at resiliency of certain systems, these nature-based solutions are much better equipped to handle sort of sudden changes in flows. We have another program around water-wise cities and also a program called Climate Smart Utilities, where we're actually working with the urban water sector to try and understand what interventions they can make in order to improve their response to climate. In terms of mitigation, it's sourcing their energy from much greener sources. It's employing technologies that use much less energy. And it's also around having much more productive use of water, so the total amount of energy needed to sustain that water cycle is minimized. Of course, there's a lot of work on energy production, green energy through anaerobic digestion and other means. And so you're seeing water utilities slowly progressing to becoming net energy zero, or even net energy positive, where they're actually selling energy back to the grid. So this Climate Smart Utilities program helps utilities understand what activities they can do in terms of mitigation to reduce their overall carbon footprint, but also looks at adaptation strategies. And in that respect, we're learning a lot from some of the emerging economies who are dealing, for example, with intermittent water supply and how they ration water. And so we're trying to build adaptive systems that can move from a 24/7 supply to a system where we are distributing water in a rational way, but maximizing the equity of supply. The last point I would say is that, after the pandemic, there has been really a huge push in many countries around this theme of building back better. And you hear this with, say, for example, Joe Biden in the UK, in Europe, they call it the Green Deal. And this is this notion that, the pandemic has created these economic stimulus packages where large investments will be made in infrastructure, and that there is this opportunity to use those investments to promote a much more climate-friendly, climate-resilient approach to the new infrastructure. So it's moving away from replacing old with new, but trying to invest much more in much more greener technologies and greener jobs. I'd just like to now summarize very briefly the presentations that we had. I thought the presentations were all very, very good and very interesting. We had Dr. Anastasia, who was talking about the investments in water infrastructure and, again, looking at the balance between investments in agriculture, industry and city infrastructure, and also this sort of need to classify blue finance instruments and green versus blue investments in the face of climate change. And also, she mentioned some interesting work around innovative insurance models that really try to protect farmers, both against droughts, but also against floods. And I know there's been a lot of very interesting research around index-based flood insurance, for example. Dr. Punia Wadina, he gave us a very good overall view of the impacts of climate change to Sri Lanka. He talked about the seasonal variations that are taking place in terms of rainfall, changes in temperature resulting in much greater evapotranspiration, and also evaporation affecting the cascading tank systems that Sri Lanka is very, very famous for. And also, the changes in climate affecting infrastructure in terms of water conveyance, so dams breaching and damage to canal infrastructure. Dr. D'Souza focused a lot around plastic pollution and, this concern around microplastics and how that is affecting our ocean's health. He also touched upon ocean acidification and that link to carbon dioxide levels, or, that the trends are very similar. Dr. Sarath Perumal looked at very similar topics to Dr. Punia Wadina, where he talked about, the changes in the seasonal variations in rainfall in terms of the monsoon seasons and what impacts that would have in terms of food production. And Dr. Vinay Dadwal was really, and I was very pleased that, he mentioned from the beginning this idea of adaptive capacity and the importance of marginal groups and the deployment of pro-poor policies. And this supports the UN agenda on leaving no one behind and the World Bank's agenda on inclusivity. And it was a very interesting presentation. Unfortunately, I couldn't see the slides. They were not moving, so I'm sure that would have enhanced the presentation. And Dr. Constantine talked about preserving fishery resources in the face of climate change, and that there needs to be a much deeper study on the seas and oceans and much more monitoring, and the impacts of degradation in biodiversity. And those impacts on fisheries, and he also touched upon some of the challenges associated with ocean acidification and what potential impacts that could have on biodiversity. In terms of questions to the panelists, I'm sorry that I gave a very brief summary, but in terms of the questions, we had a question from Dr. Kalanithy, I think from India. And the question was, with rainfall anomalies in dry zones, so I think this is to the two speakers from Sri Lanka. So with respect to rainfall anomalies in the dry zone and the cascade impacts on soil fertility, what do you see the impact on the endemic issue of CKDU, the chronic kidney diseases in the dry zone of Sri Lanka? So